I want to start with a shoe. Not a bone, not a legend, not a skull in a museum drawer. A shoe, woven from marsh reeds, pulled out of a cave in the Nevada desert, and it measures 15 inches long. Hold your own foot up against that in your head for a second. 15 inches. Whoever wore that was not a normal-sized person. And the tribe that lived in this valley, the northern Paiute, had a name for the people who did. That name is Si-Te-Cah. You'll hear it online attached to 10-foot cannibal giants with flaming red hair who sailed across the ocean and terrorized the American West. That's the version that made this cave famous. It's also the version that falls apart the moment you actually pull the thread. Because here's the first thing almost nobody tells you. Si-Te-Cah does not mean giant. In the northern Paiute language, it means tule eaters, after the tule reed, the marsh plant that grows all through this basin. That's the verifiable, boring, linguistic fact. The word at the center of the whole mystery isn't even a word about size. So what actually happened here? That's the question I couldn't put down, and it's the one this entire video is chasing. Because the real story of Lovelock Cave isn't a monster story. It's the story of a real oral tradition, a real cave and real oversized objects, layered over with a century of invention. And then, before anyone could sort out which was which, most of the evidence got shoveled into sacks and shipped to San Francisco as fertilizer. That's not a figure of speech. I'll get to it. But that's the part that gets me. The more famous this place became, the less of the real evidence survived. So let's actually take it apart, layer by layer, and see what's left standing when we're done. Let me set the ground first, because the ground matters more than you'd think. Lovelock Cave sits in northwestern Nevada, about 20 miles south of the town of Lovelock, overlooking a place called the Humboldt Sink. If you drive out there today, you follow a long dirt road through cracked, bone-dry desert, and you climb a narrow path up a jagged slope to a dark opening in the rock. It does not look like a paradise. It looks like the far edge of nowhere, but it wasn't always. During the last ice age, this whole region was underwater. It was the floor of a vast Pleistocene lake called Lake Lahontan that covered much of western Nevada. And the cave itself started as something even stranger than a cave. Originally, it was a long shed-like rock shelter, roughly 150 feet across and 35 feet deep, sitting above the water. Over time, earthquakes and the slow work of erosion brought masses of rock crashing down from the roof, sealing up the front of that shelter and turning it into the enclosed cave we know now. So the shape of the place is itself a record of deep time. It was open, and then the earth closed it. When Lake Lahontan receded, it left behind marshes and wetlands fed by the Humboldt River, the longest river in Nevada. And those marshes were rich, waterfowl by the thousands, fish, tule reeds, and cattail for weaving and building. A place that could feed people generously, right on the edge of country that could kill you. And it did feed people for thousands of years. Archaeologists have a name for the culture that lived along these lakes and marshes. They call it the Lovelock culture. And this very cave is what gave the whole culture its name. Human occupation here runs back somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years, with the deepest layers of debris resting almost directly on the old lakebed sediments, meaning people moved in within a century or two of the water pulling back. And here's a detail I find quietly astonishing. Coprolites recovered from the cave, which is the polite scientific word for preserved ancient human waste, showed that around 90% of these people's diet came straight out of the Humboldt Sink. They ate fish of every size, caught with nets, with traps, with hooks carved from fish bone. These were not marauding giants. These were skilled marsh people, and they were extraordinarily good at living exactly where they lived. And I want to be honest with you about something up front, because it changes how you hear everything that follows. This cave, with 0 giants involved, is already one of the most important archaeological sites in all of North America. The material that came out of here is genuinely staggering on its own terms. So keep that in your back pocket as the giant story gets louder and louder, because the real treasure was never the thing everyone came looking for. The real treasure was the ordinary, brilliant lives of the people who were actually here. Here's the example that always stops me. Among the artifacts recovered from Lovelock Cave was a cache of 11 duck decoys, woven from tule reed and cattail, bound with cordage, wrapped in real feathers, shaped and colored to sit on the water and lure live ducks in close. When those decoys were finally radiocarbon dated, they came back to roughly 2,000 years old, somewhere in the range of a few hundred years before Christ. They are among the oldest known duck decoys anywhere on Earth. You can go and see them. They're held at the Smithsonian. Think about the knowledge packed into that object. That is not the work of a lost race of barbarians. That's a sophisticated wetland people who understood their marsh so intimately, so completely, that they could build a fake bird convincing enough to fool the real ones. That's who was really living in this cave. And I think it matters that we say that clearly before we go anywhere near the monsters, because the monsters have spent 100 years drowning these people out. And the science backs the whole picture, in ordinary, patient detail. When researchers ran radiocarbon dating on material from the cave, the numbers came back deep and consistent. Vegetable matter dating to around 2,000 years before Christ, a human femur to roughly 1450 BC, human tissue to around 1420, basketry to about 1200. Layer after layer, a continuous human presence stretching back well over 3,000 years, right down onto the sediments left by the old lake. This wasn't a one-time massacre site. It was a home, used and reused across an almost unimaginable span of time. Basketry styles shifted and evolved over that 3,000-year period, the way fashions and technologies always do, which is itself a kind of fingerprint of continuous, ordinary human life. People raising children, weaving, fishing, burying their dead, for 30 centuries. And there's a genuine, unsolved archaeological question folded into all of this, one that has nothing to do with giants and everything to do with real history. The Lovelock culture, the people who made those decoys, eventually gave way to the northern Paiute, most likely somewhere around 1,000 years ago. What exactly happened in that transition, whether it was gradual replacement, absorption, conflict, migration, or some mix of all of them, is still debated by serious archaeologists today. And I find myself wondering whether that real, documented cultural turnover, one people giving way to another around this same marsh, is part of what got compressed and dramatized over many centuries of oral retelling into a story about a final war against a rival people at a cave. That's speculation on my part, and I'll flag it as exactly that. But the raw ingredients for the legend, a real transition between real peoples, are sitting right there in the archaeology. So now, the legend. Because there is a real Paiute oral tradition here, and it deserves to be handled with some care instead of turned into a cartoon. The one genuine traceable source for it is a woman named Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins. She was the daughter of a Paiute leader, a writer, and a lecturer, and in 1882 she published a book called Life Among the Paiutes, Their Wrongs and Claims. It made her, by many accounts, the first Native American woman to copyright a book in the United States. That's not a small thing, and inside it, she wrote down a story her people had carried orally for generations. Her account runs roughly like this. Long ago, a small band of hostile people lived among or near the Paiute. She describes them as enemies, as barbarians, and in her telling as cannibalistic, people who killed and ate their captives. There was conflict over a span of years, a long war, and it ended when the Paiute and allied tribes drove the last of these enemies into a cave, sealed the mouth of it with brush and firewood, and set it burning. The ones who stayed inside were suffocated. The few who tried to break out through the smoke were killed as they emerged. Now sit with what she actually wrote against what you've probably heard. In her telling, these are enemies, barbarians, a rival people. She does not say they were 10 feet tall. She does not say their hair was red. The word giant, the flaming red hair, the voyage across the ocean on reed rafts. A great deal of that is simply not in the earlier source. It got added later by other people, for other reasons. And that gap, the space between what the Paiute actually said and what the internet now claims the Paiute said, is the real haunted thing in this whole story. Not the cave, the distance between the tradition and the myth. And here's a detail that almost never survives the retelling, because it quietly dismantles the monster version. When archaeologists later recorded the local Paiute account of who had lived in that cave, the answer they got wasn't giants at all. It was that the earlier inhabitants had been Pit River Indians, a neighboring people, whom the Paiute had driven out. A human conflict between human neighbors over good land at the edge of a rich marsh, which is an enormously different story than seaborne titans. And, if I'm honest, it's a lot more like how history actually tends to go. Peoples move, peoples clash, peoples get pushed off the land they need. That's not folklore. That's the ordinary machinery of the human past. So we've got a real tradition about a real conflict that supposedly ended at a real cave. And if any of that were literally true, you would expect one very specific piece of physical evidence to be waiting for us. You'd expect the cave to show signs of burning. Hold on to that, because we're about to walk into the year 1886 and then into 1911. And 1911 is where the genuine tragedy of this entire story actually lives. The first outsider to take the legend seriously has a name: John T. Reed, a mining engineer based in Lovelock. In 1886, while he was prospecting in the area, a group of local Paiutes told him the story, and they insisted it was real, and they took him to see the cave for himself to prove that at least the place existed. And here is the small, sharp, almost cruel detail that the giant hunters tend to skip right past. Reed went into that cave in 1886, fully believing he was about to find something extraordinary, and he found nothing but tons of bat guano. No giants, no bones on display, no obvious mummies waiting under a spotlight. Just a dark shelter, packed floor to ceiling with the accumulated droppings of who knows how many centuries of bats. He was convinced he was onto something, and he couldn't get a formal dig going. And so the cave just sat there, its real content sealed under all that guano, waiting. And I keep coming back to Reed standing at that entrance. If it were me, told by the people who'd carried this story for generations, that the legend was true and it was right here, right in front of me, I would have wanted to dig that day with my bare hands. He couldn't. He didn't have the means or the backing. And that delay, that ordinary, unglamorous failure to get funding, is where the whole thing starts to go wrong. Because the next people to open that cave weren't looking for history at all. The men who actually reopened Lovelock Cave were not archaeologists. They were not looking for giants, or the Paiute, or the past. or anything of the kind. They were looking for bat guano. Guano, bat and bird droppings was genuinely valuable. It's rich in nitrates, and it was used both as agricultural fertilizer and as an ingredient in gunpowder. In 1911, two miners named David Pugh and James Hart were hired to strip the guano out of Lovelock Cave and sell it. And they went at it precisely the way you'd expect men chasing a raw commodity to go at it. Pick and shovel, speed over care, no regard for anything that wasn't guano. They removed a layer estimated at 3 to 6 feet deep across the entire cave floor. They screened it out on the hillside to separate the droppings from the debris, and they shipped roughly 250 tons of it to a fertilizer company in San Francisco. 250 tons. And buried in that material, mixed all the way through it, was one of the richest archaeological deposits on the continent. It went out by the ton, sold, spread on distant fields, gone. This is the antagonist of the story. This right here. Not the Si-Te-Cah, not the Paiute, who are the ones actually telling the truth in all of this. The villain of Lovelock Cave is a shovel and a shipping invoice. And the part I genuinely cannot stop thinking about is this. The miners knew there were artifacts down there. They saw them. They weren't blind. They simply kept the handful of objects they personally found interesting and threw the rest onto the spoil heap. Everything that might have actually answered the giant question, the context, the layers, the arrangement of the bones, sorted through and mostly discarded by two men who were being paid by the ton of bird droppings. And they mined it for a full year before anyone in the scientific world was even told. It was only when the ancient debris got so thick, so dense with baskets and bones and refuse, that they physically could not keep collecting clean guano through it, that the mining company finally reached out to the University of California. That's when a man named L.L. Loud arrived. He was sent in 1912 by the anthropologist Alfred Kroeber, and he spent about 5 months excavating whatever was left in the wreckage. A second, far more careful expedition followed in 1924, led by Mark Harrington. And decades later, in the 1960s and 70s, the archaeologist Robert Heiser would come back to study the site with genuinely modern methods. 3 waves of real science, all of them arriving after the damage was already done. And here's the thing that tells you how staggeringly rich this place must have been to begin with. Even after that catastrophe, even picking through the leftovers of a full year of guano mining, Loud and the teams that followed still recovered something like 10,000 artifacts. The duck decoys, baskets, some of them dating back over 2,000 years, nets, an ancient sling, sandals, including the famous oversized ones, bone tools, human remains, a record thousands of years deep. And that's just what survived the shovels. The Hearst Museum at Berkeley eventually put it about as plainly as an academic institution ever will. The site had been extensively pot-hunted, they wrote, with a great deal of its material scattered into private collections. And yet, despite years of destruction, Lovelock Cave remains one of the most important sites in the entire history of North American archaeology. Both of those things are true at the same time. It was gutted, and it's still priceless. That's the measure of what was lost. You destroy most of something, and the remainder is still one of the most important finds on the continent. Now let's deal with the giants directly, because that's what you came here for, and I'm not going to dodge it. I'm going to walk you through step by step exactly how a 6.5-foot man becomes a 10-foot monster. Because the beautiful, maddening thing is, you can actually watch it happen right there in the historical record. It's not a mystery. It's a game of telephone, played across 100 years. Start at the source. James Hart, one of the 2 guano miners, described finding a mummy, and he put a number on it, roughly 6 feet, 6 inches. Now, 6'6" is tall. It's tall today. It was very tall for the ancient Great Basin population, where average heights ran considerably shorter than ours. So lying next to the smaller skeletons around it, some of them apparently female, a 6.5-foot man would have looked, in Hart's own word, like a giant. And that's the seed. That's the entire seed of the legend, right there. One unusually tall man in a room full of average and below average people. Then watch the number climb. In the retellings, it becomes 7 feet, then 8 feet. A male over 8 feet, paired with a female at 6.5. Then it becomes 8.5. And then, in a 1931 newspaper report in the Nevada Review Minor, describing skeletons supposedly found in a dry lake bed near Lovelock, it reaches 8.5 and nearly 10 feet. The bodies said to be wrapped in a gum-covered fabric, like Egyptian mummies. Every single time the story gets retold, the bones get longer. And notice, nobody is measuring anything new. There's no new excavation, no new tape measure. The number is simply growing in the telling, the exact way a fish grows in the story after it's been caught. And here's the hard check on all of it. In the mid-1970s, a University of Nevada study looked at the actual remains associated with the site and concluded the individuals were around 6 feet tall. Not 10, not 8, about 6. And that lines up with the museum curators who've handled the surviving bones from the old Reed collection and put the tallest around 6'2". Tall for their time and place, genuinely remarkable, but a human being, not a titan. So that's your giant. He's real, in the sense that a genuinely tall man really was buried in that cave, and he's completely invented in the sense that the 10-foot cannibal you've seen in 100 thumbnails never existed anywhere except in the widening space between one retelling and the next. Both of those things are true at once, and I think holding both of them at the same time, without collapsing into either the debunker's sneer or the believer's fantasy, is the only honest way to stand in front of this thing. But there is one detail the height explanation doesn't cover, and it's the detail that keeps this legend breathing no matter how many times the giants get knocked down: the red hair. Because that part isn't simply invented. Some of the remains genuinely did have reddish hair. Sarah Winnemucca herself reportedly kept some of it and showed it during her lectures. So where does red hair on ancient Nevada mummies actually come from, if not from some lost red-headed race? Here's the answer, and it's frustrating precisely because it's so ordinary. According to the Nevada State Museum, dark hair does not stay dark forever. In a dry, alkaline environment like this cave, over hundreds or thousands of years, the pigment in black hair breaks down and chemically shifts toward rust, toward red, toward orange. The very same reddening turns up on ancient remains in completely different parts of the world, including mummies that everyone agrees started out with dark hair. The hair on these bodies didn't grow in red. It became red, lying in the dark, slowly, for 2,000 years. And this is the part I find genuinely eerie, and I want to be careful, because eerie is not the same word as supernatural. A real chemical process, hair reddening in an alkaline cave, and a real oral tradition landed on the exact same detail: red hair. And now they're so tangled together that you almost can't say which one fed the other. Did the tradition invent red-haired enemies, and then, centuries later, the cave happened to hand us red-haired mummies by pure chemistry? Or did the old Paiute simply notice something true about these ancient remains and fold it into the story they were already telling? I don't think we can fully separate them anymore, and that, to me, is far more interesting than any giant. Two real things, a chemical reaction and a human memory, pointing straight at each other across 2,000 years. Which brings us to the uncomfortable outer layer. Because a large amount of what you'll read about the Si-Te-Cah online was never Paiute tradition at all. Skeptical researchers who have gone looking for the 10-foot giant version inside actual, documented Paiute folklore have come up largely empty-handed. The oldest solid source remains Winnemucca's 1882 account of hostile barbarians. Not titans, not a red-haired master race, not sailors fleeing a sunken island on rafts of woven reed. The giant layer, the comparisons to the biblical Nephilim, the lost civilization across the ocean framing, and the parallels people love to draw to red-haired, elongated skulls near Lake Titicaca in South America. A great deal of that was grafted on later. Grafted on by fringe writers, by lost race enthusiasts, by people who badly wanted these bones to prove something the bones themselves never said. And it's a pattern that shows up again and again with indigenous stories. You take a genuine tradition, you strip out what it actually meant to the people who told it, and you bolt a monster onto it. The Paiute told a story about a war with human enemies. Other people, much later and mostly for profit or spectacle, turned those enemies into giants and turned that history into a curiosity to be sold. And I want to pause on why this particular myth is so incredibly sticky, because I don't think it's an accident. Stories about a lost race of giants show up all over the Americas and all over the world, really. Part of it is simple. Giants are a satisfying explanation for anything old and impressive. Big mounds, big bones, big monuments. If you don't know who built something, or you don't want to credit the people who actually did, a race of vanished giants is a tidy answer. And in North America specifically, there's an uglier thread running through it. For a long stretch of history, the idea that some grander, whiter, lost civilization built the impressive things on this continent was a way of writing the actual indigenous peoples out of their own achievements. When you turn the enemies in a Paiute story into 10-foot barbarians from across the ocean, you are, whether you mean to or not, taking a piece of native history and handing it to a fantasy. That's the machinery underneath a lot of these tales, and it's worth naming out loud. The Lake Titicaca comparison is a perfect example of how this works. People love to point at elongated skulls and supposedly red-haired remains found near that lake, high in the Andes on the border of Peru and Bolivia, and say, look, giants there too, the same red-haired race. It all connects. But those elongated skulls are very well understood. They're the result of intentional cranial shaping, binding an infant's head to reshape the skull as it grows, a practice documented in many cultures. And the reddish tint gets the same ordinary explanation as at Lovelock, the burial environment acting on the hair over centuries. Two completely separate sites, two completely mundane explanations, stitched together into one grand mystery by people who wanted the mystery more than they wanted the answer. Once you see the pattern, you see it everywhere in this genre. There's a final chapter to this that I think matters, and it's a quieter one. For many years, human remains from this region were displayed in museums, here in Nevada and elsewhere, labeled and boxed as historical artifacts. That has changed. Most of those bones and skulls have since been returned to the tribes for proper burial. So if oversized Lovelock bones ever truly existed in the form the legend claims, they are no longer sitting in a public display case for anyone to go and measure. They've been handed back to descendants and laid to rest. And I think that's the right ending, even though it means the physical trail goes quiet. These were people, not exhibits. The State Museum up in Winnemucca now goes so far as to warn visitors right at its front entrance that the red-headed giants are a myth. The institution closest to the evidence is the one telling you plainly not to believe the story. So let me set the layers back in order, cleanly, because honestly, that ordering is the whole thing. Layer 1, at the bottom. A real cave occupied by a real and genuinely sophisticated marsh people for thousands of years, who left behind duck decoys and baskets and nets and one unusually tall man. Layer 2, on top of that, a real Paiute oral tradition, faithfully carried for generations and finally written down in 1882 about a war with hostile human neighbors that may well have ended at a cave. Layer 3, piled on top of both, a century of invention, the giants, the cannibalism taken as literal, established fact, the ocean voyage, the 10-foot skeletons that grow another foot with every retelling. And then, running underneath all three layers like a fault line, the guano miners, who took the one layer of physical evidence that might have let us actually tell the difference between the first two and sold it by the ton in 1911. So I'll leave you exactly where I started, with the shoe. 15 inches of woven reed, pulled out of the dark. And here's the thing, we can still measure it. We can still hold it. What we cannot do is ask it who wore it, because the context that would have told us, the layer of earth it was resting in, the objects buried alongside it, the arrangement of everything an archaeologist actually needs to read a site and reconstruct a life, that context went to San Francisco in a sack in 1911, screened out on a hillside and shipped off as fertilizer. The giants almost certainly weren't 10 feet tall. They almost certainly weren't cannibals in any literal sense. They almost certainly did not sail here from a drowned island in the sea. But a real people did live and die in that cave. A real tribe did remember a real conflict and carried that memory faithfully across generations until somebody finally wrote it down. And men with shovels sold most of the answer as fertilizer before anyone thought to look closely. What haunts me here isn't the monster. It's how close we came to actually knowing. And it's that the loudest version of this story, the one with the 10-foot giants and the flaming red hair and the cannibal war, is the version with the least evidence left standing behind it. While the quietest part of the whole record, the Chul Eaters and their 2,000-year-old duck decoys, is the part that is actually verifiably true. That's the real ghost of Lovelock Cave. Not a giant, a people remembered wrong by a world that found their real lives less interesting than a myth, and their real lives were the better story all along.